All right, this is Libertarian Overwatch, and today we are covering another one of Justin Raimondo's articles for antiwar.com. And this one we have is Who Killed Rafik Hariri in Lebanon. So this is when we're going into the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, and the year is set in 2005. And so what kind of sets off this revolution compared to the other ones, instead of where we have elections and things of that nature? This one we have a bombing and an assassination as well. So this is a very interesting article, and it kind of goes in line with some of the more recent ones I've been talking about. Kind of, if you checked out the last episode where we talked about the Yushchenko poisoning episode, where we're getting different reports at the time in 2004 that later on we get a little bit more information and things like that. Same is the case here in 2005 with Lebanon and the Cedar Revolution. So at this time, we're trying to figure out essentially, who did this. So this had just happened. And we don't have a full case at the time yet. But one thing I do want to point to is if we go down here, and Justin does a good job kind of tackling some of the more like conspiracy-minded things here, things that just, simple analysis he's able to debunk, in real time. But then this is a story that I definitely want to cover a little bit, because I think it's another interesting one in which, during my research for the Cedar Revolution, it's something that Justin pointed me towards, which I thought was really important to kind of look at. The story of Lothar Wick in 2004 in Ukraine, I think was really important to check out. And I think this is also another really important one to check out. And so it is this individual here, Ahmed Taisir Abu Adas, who is a 24-year-old Palestinian refugee from Beirut. So disappearing around my mother's birthday, January 15th. And later showed up in a video broadcast by Al Jazeera claiming responsibility for the assassination on behalf of a previously unknown jihadist outfit. And according to Reuters, authorities did DNA tests on the remains of the body found at the scene and to establish they belonged to Abu Adas. So one thing I actually want to go to right now, which I think is very interesting, is this article over here. So this is from 2015, so this is a little bit past the point. But the one thing I do want to point out here is when we get to the story of Abu Adas in 2015. So 10 years later, but still, we have here, finally, there was the problem of the DNA evidence. Forensic experts collected hundreds of body parts at the site, and most were identified as belonging to Hariri, members of his entourage, and other known victims. Some 100 samples were genetically compatible with one another, but not with the identified victims. The scattered pattern of those parts showed that they belonged to the person closest to the explosion. This was the suicide bomber. Investigations compared this DNA to the scrapings from Adas's toothbrush, and they were unambiguous. He was not the bomber. So just something I would like to kind of point out here. But there's no hyperlink to the Reuters here, but I do think, is that the Reuters one there? But I have no doubt that this reporting actually genuinely did happen, because something also I want to point to is this one. This article is from the Washington Times, and it lays bare some pretty extreme claims about Adas. If you cannot tell, there is zero author credited to this article, which I think is just something interesting, because even in my research for this, I really would have liked to email whoever wrote this article and just kind of talk about it and things like that. Because there's like some linkage here, between Adas and even Zarqawi. And just things that I would like to know more about, where this article does not really go in depth in the matter. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the Justin article. So if we were to scroll down a little bit here. So as I said, we kind of talked about the Cedar Revolution a little bit here. And also kind of that relationship that exists between Lebanon and Syria at the time of the Cedar Revolution, which I think is another important thing to kind of point to as well, where you kind of have different factions who in odd ways want to point the blame of, who did this assassination, So that's also something that I think is worth mentioning here as well. But I think this is also an interesting one here too. The Beirut Spring, which is just funny kind of thinking about the terms of some of these revolutions. And of course, when we get to, the 2010s, we start to see the Arab Spring and things like that. But as we go a little bit down here, we start to talk about Abu Adas a little bit more here. And this is also another interesting one, is that Wahhabism is, in Justin's article, I'm currently in 2002 in his articles, and, in the aftermath of 9/11, he's kind of pointing to how some of the more neoconservative leaning individuals in the newspapers at the time and things like that, think like your Max Boots or something like that, were pointing to Wahhabism and Saudi, and Justin was kind of, I don't want to say deflecting, but just kind of saying like, why are we treating this as this great evil and things like that? But by this time, the perception has changed a little bit. So as we go along here, like I said, kind of talking about the relation to Zarqawi and things like that. They're very extreme claims that I wish had a little bit more sourcing and things like that, because I could not find a lot of this information through multiple searches. And even the Al Jazeera video, which has been discussed a few times, about how he essentially, that is where he first came to know Adas. Let me see if I can even find it in here. Jazeera. There we go. Yes, the video broadcast by Al Jazeera claiming responsibility for the assassination attempt. That video has gone to the ether. I spent hours, probably 3 hours, just looking for that video, and I could not find it anywhere. So just thought I'd mention that there. Now, there are a few different articles I kind of want to look at here. This is another one that came out in 2011. This is by Gareth Porter, who has done a lot of really great journalism throughout the years. But in this one, it also is talking about Adas and things like that. And I think the conclusion reached by Porter here is that essentially it was not Adas who was responsible for this assassination and things like that. And then, we kind of talk about the Adas videotape here and things like that. And then I think once we get to the end of Porter's report, is kind of his conclusion is that kind of right about this range right here, where he's saying that he believes Adas was involved with Al-Qaeda. And so essentially, he was convinced to make this videotape that went public on Al Jazeera and things like that. And it's funny because you can't even, at this point, you can't even find screenshots of the video, not even like a still. Sometimes you can find that, like when I'm looking at, currently I'm working on the April 6th movement in Egypt for 2008 for that Anatomy of a Regime Change series. And you can find certain articles, but you're not able to click on them because the links have been dead or no one saved on Internet Archive and things like that. But you can't even see that, here anywhere throughout my research on it and things like that. But yeah, as you can see here, like I said, a lot of things about being coerced and delivering the videotape and things like that. So this is another article I think is worth reading. And in fact, I think both these articles are really worth reading. But, as we go here, I'll get past that Washington Times article. Like I said, I have some general questions about this one. So once we get to 2022, we're seeing a Hezbollah duo that is convicted of the 2005 bombing on appeal. The UN-backed court had convicted them on appeal. And as you can see here, some of these convictions, they denied involvement in this assassination. No evidence ever implicated them as well in this. So kind of, some background information on Hariri. And as you can see here, this bombing was extensive. Look how deep, it goes down right here. And right after this time too, a lot of journalists in the area, independent journalists, even ones who, it was like the sons of the journalists who first formed some of these newspapers and things like that. They're also dying from bombings, car bombings, things like that around this time. So, it's a really scary, really intense situation in Lebanon at the time. But as we go along, like I said, I think it's just some interesting things here. And then this is the thing that really kind of opened my eyes a lot here, is that this chamber trial, and where they're found guilty of charges and things like that. And then also this one's really important too here, where the prosecution said that shortly after the attack, there's a videotape of false claim of responsibility made by a Palestinian man. So now we know that is Abu Adas on behalf of a fictional Sunni fundamentalist group, and sure, that was broadcast on Al Jazeera TV. So, as I said here, we mentioned the DNA evidence. This is from the New York Times article talking about the Hezbollah connection. And like I said, kind of talking about Abu Hadas, he's living with his parents in Beirut, Lebanon, kind and friendly. They were told by investigators and things like that, weak physically. So it kind of gives some of this background things here. And then I want to see, yep, right here. Now, scholar phoned again and told the reporter that he would broadcast the video right away, or he would regret it shortly afterward. The tape was aired. In the recording, you can see him dressed in black, sporting a beard and a white turban, reading from a sheet of paper. Like I said, I wish we had the visual evidence of this. But anyways, we say, like, in the name of Allah. You can read it all here, and things like that, and about how the UN helped with some of the forensics and things like that. So we mentioned the right here, the trial chamber. And so that is the point I really want to get to here. So this is very extensive, as you can see here, 2,682 pages here. But this is the tribunal kind of discussing Abu Adas. So as we can see here in the video, which Al Jazeera broadcast later in the afternoon, Palestinian man named Abu Adas claimed to represent the fundamentalist group, as you can see here, and it was carried out by Abu Adas. The prosecution termed this as a false claim of responsibility for the attack on Mr. Hariri. And indeed it was. The group is fictional, and Mr. Abu Hadas did not kill himself in the explosion. He was not the suicide bomber. Religious 22-year-old disappeared from his home in Beirut on the morning of Sunday, January 16th. So when it said, the last day he was seen was the 15th, right before that. Family had not seen him since. And then we see kind of those names we mentioned earlier about who was actually convicted in the case of this. I want to go a little bit later here too, but yeah, we see the false claim of responsibility for the attack immediately after. They disseminated statements falsely attributing responsibility for the attack. So I want to go further on here too. Prosecution, and this was mentioned in the BBC article I just showed too, about how someone had approached them in a mosque. And then gosh. So the thing is, as you can see here, there are 1,000 links here. So one of the things I do want to find, if I can find it in here, is that there was mentions of a driver's license. And I think this is something that is kind of important too here. I need to refresh it just because the file is so big. But it's kind of, some of it is family statements and things like that. But I think it does give a bigger picture into what we're looking at in the case of Abu Adas and things like that. Essentially, his family was kind of saying, we have no reason to believe he was involved in some of these things. But, we'll kind of find out on here where specifically they're talking about this. So good thing we only have a few hits for driver's license here. So as we go along here, and I want to say it was from his father that mentioned this. And there we can see kind of a photo of the explosion there. All right. Yeah, this is the one unfortunate thing, is that this document is so large that you can see how it's hard to find things. And then also, as mentioned in the case of Abu Adas, that, there are some things that were on his laptop and things like that, some like fundamentalist, religion kind of things. But essentially, they kind of chalked it up to something that could, very easily, be planted on someone's laptop and things like that. So I think that's another very important thing to notice as well. All right, we're going to try to search this one more time as we go along here. But yeah, a very, very long document for sure. There is a lot of information in here, and it's something that I was perusing for quite a bit when I first discovered this. And now I want to mention here too is that this comes out in 2022. So this is almost 20 years after the original Justin article comes out. Justin was, right on top of it. I mean, like as soon as it came out, essentially, the story. That is not what I'm looking for quite yet. There we go. I knew I could find it. So anyways, as we go here, we start to get a little bit more about Abu Adas and people who are able to talk a little bit about him. Friends saying he's very simple, even simple-minded, lazy, never talked about politics, his belief or ideologies, no political affiliation. In particular, he never expressed a view about Mr. Hariri. And so, yeah, these are the things that I wanted to point to, too, where we're talking about the car bomb and things like that. He did not have a driver's license, did not know how to drive. He was making plans for the future. Another witness said that he was planning on getting married, asked his family to purchase the bride's dress. And then, at least a year before, he becomes a little bit more religiously committed than the rest of his family. Followed with it, he grew a beard, generally wore Islamic clothing, attended mosque and prayer, usually 5 times a day. attending the mosque and things like that. The trial chamber also heard evidence from a witness who met someone who was calling himself Muhammad that he met in the mosque in early January, and said that Das sometimes led the prayer and deputized for the imam, and so stated that he was very interested in preaching and inviting people to join his religion. He said a lot of different information here, that he was quiet. As we mentioned earlier too, we saw previously mentioned about how the DNA was kind of not matching and things like that. But it really just gives a little bit almost like a case study of Abu Adas, attending the mosque daily and things like that. And they're saying that they're surprised by the behavior. And also, when he left, I know I can't find it right now, but his mom was essentially saying how, we're surprised. We don't know exactly where he went. He just kind of went out the door and got into a car. We didn't know exactly what happened at the time and things like that. So a very, very extensive case into Abu Adas. So essentially kind of what we're getting at here too is that this initial story about Abu Adas being the bomber and things like that. I think at this point in 2026, we can pretty confidently say Abu Adas was not involved in the bombing. Now, was he, as Gareth Porter kind of posts here, was he a member of Al-Qaeda? Possibly. We don't exactly fully know the full picture at this point, I don't believe. The Washington Times is very declarative in him being a member of Al-Qaeda, or was it just someone who was set up to film and record these things? It's definitely a very interesting case study. Like I said, the only thing I can pretty confidently say at this point is that he was not the actual bomber. But if you know more about this story, please let me know. If you're able to find that Al Jazeera piece, please let me know. I think that would be really interesting to opening it all up. But yeah, definitely check out that tribunal. It's just extensive information that I think is very, very important to glean and give like a better understanding of the whole Abu Adas kind of story and things like that. So that is kind of our recap of the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon. Video, before I remove myself, if you have enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share it, things like that. I'm having a fun time kind of going through these different series, these different articles from Justin. We're looking at Kyrgyzstan for our next one. And then I think by the time we get to 2006, we're going to have our Color Revolutions Turn to Black, which is kind of like an overview of Georgia, of Ukraine, of Lebanon, of Kyrgyzstan, and things like that. So stay tuned for that one.